So welcome to Unit 3. This is focused on looking at an all-hazards approach to planning. As you know, I am the state planner for both Homeland Security and Emergency Management, and we don't differentiate the two in terms of process, and that's the way that this class is being taught in terms of planning. You're not going to differentiate between Homeland Security and Emergency Management. Fundamentally, the tenets don't change for the two, so we will look at it from an all-hazards approach. So we'll be going over one IS course, 230A, and then we'll be doing a couple readings in the Perry and Lindell's, chapter 6 and 14. We'll also look at some plans that the state of Alaska has developed, our hazard mitigation plan and the EOP. We'll also look at the National Response Framework, and of course we will address the National Incident Management System, which was covered in Unit 2. So we're going right into it, looking at the IS courses, the fundamentals of emergency management. The reason why I introduced this in Unit 3 rather than more at the beginning was the fundamentals of all hazards really encompasses emergency management fundamentals. And in other words, the way that the national and the state and local trend is, an emergency manager has to look at hazards from all types of threats. You can't delineate between the way that you approach it from a broader perspective, from terrorism versus natural hazards, because the emergency management is emergency management. So that's why I chose it to emphasize it here at the all hazards approach. From that, you want to get out of the IS course, besides taking the quiz, is that it's not about response from a planning perspective. It's about incident management. So what does that mean? As an emergency manager, and especially as a planner, you want to quickly transition from response to recovery. In other words, you want to manage the incident so it's stabilized, so that it's, or plan to manage the incident so it's stabilized, and then transition for reconstitution or recovery. You don't want to keep fighting. You don't want to keep fighting that threat over and over again. So that's what you want to get out of emergency management. You also recognize that there are multiple types of response, and of course the big federal and the international ones gets all the coverage. But looking at it from a response and planning capability, the crux of it is, in terms of an emergency manager, is from a community approach. I think I mentioned in the earlier units that ultimately it's individual preparedness that'll get to it, that'll make a difference in terms of the starting point of emergency planning and response. But the complexities are introduced at the local level, and all management of incidents are done at the local level. So that's one of the key pieces that I want you to get out of the SIS class. And think of, from a planning perspective, emergency management as project management. Not only is mitigation, planning, response, recovery the elements of Homeland Security emergency management, or tenets, but there's also a funding component towards it, especially at the state and federal level, is that you want to be able to manage your resource assets, especially from a planning perspective, in terms of dollars and fiscal responsibility, and that leads into project management. So as you go through this IS 230 course, always keep in mind that there's a fiscal component towards emergency management, Homeland Security. So with that, have fun with the IS 230 class. Moving on to the Perry and Lindell coursework. As I said before, as we go through the first chapter and the planning process, make sure you don't delineate between Homeland Security and emergency management. It's the same approach, all hazards. Just because a terrorism threat, the preparedness activities for terrorism threats, such as hardening your infrastructure, is the same thing as hardening infrastructure for a tsunami. It's the same principles. You have an outreach component, a multi-agency coordination piece, incident management piece about ICS, managing resources. So it's the same level of tenant proficiency that you have to have for catching terrorists, or defending against terrorists, 2, deterring against or mitigating against tsunamis. So, the same thing. And that leads to the fact that fundamentals are fundamentals. They don't change over time. It hasn't been since the inception of FEMA, since the inception of emergency management, back to the civil defense days when there was a big nuclear threat. So keep that in mind as you're going through the emergency management process. When you're looking at the next chapter, fostering emergency planning, and I hit this over and over again, is it's not about products but process when you look at planning. Yes, product may be the deliverable, but to get to the product, that's one, it makes sense, and 2, that shows that you get it, is the process itself. Because if you have a product, then it's just that you just don't, that it just doesn't make sense, or doesn't, or comes to find out that you don't get it, defeats the purpose of the product itself. In other words, that plan is going to sit on the shelf because it didn't make sense and the authors didn't get it. So it's about the process. And of course, as discussed was in Unit 2, planning can't be done in a vacuum. It has to be done with collaboration, and that's one of the difficult pieces of emergency management. Is fostering that emergency management planning through multi-agency coordination. And we'll look at some additional selected mandates for the planning piece. Moving on to the various plans. The Alaska State Hazard Mitigation Plan is a very thick document, so look through the hazards piece, threat hazards piece, and look towards some of the hazard mitigation strategy. Emphasize on those 2 key things. Don't read all 900 pages of it because you just go insane. But recognize that the plan itself is all hazards, even though hazard mitigation is a natural hazard type of plan. It is all hazards. So there's a cybersecurity component, for example. So recognize that. Look at the emergency operations plan from the form of concept of operation. That's the crux of an emergency operations plan, is how are you going to operate your incident management process for whatever, in this case would be the state. And the concept of operation does that. So as you go through in the subsequent pieces of this class on the methodologies, refining and understanding the concept of operation is critical in terms of the response plan, because it basically tells you how things are going to be done. You'll also read the National Response Framework. It's just the guide or the framework, as the name implies, of how the federal government will respond. It's mainly a command and control piece. In other words, how you would organize to delineate areas of responsibility. So it's not really an action plan. It's basically saying you've got this. It's a turf plan, in other words. And again, recognize that it doesn't delineate between man-made versus natural hazards. And then, of course, reread through the National Incident Management System and how the components are designed to transcend the man-made versus natural hazard. In other words, it's threat independent. So focus on that. So with that, good luck with Unit 3, and happy reading, and I will look forward to your discussion questions.